Hello friends, my name is JJ, and a few weeks ago I made a video where I documented what I think is an interesting phenomenon here on YouTube, which is that Canadian YouTubers who specialize in socio-cultural commentary do not tend to talk much about Canada. I have always found this to be a little bit curious because, as you may know, I am a commentary type YouTuber from Canada, and I have always found Canada to be a very irresistible topic of discussion. In my opinion, almost any sort of commentary or analysis benefits from a location-specific perspective, and this is something that I often find myself wishing that more Canadian content creators realized. But that said, today I want to emphasize a point that I did not make in that video, and I do not believe, which is the idea that there is something inherently wrong with Canadians spending a great deal of time talking about American social, cultural, or political matters. Because of the knee-jerk anti-Americanism of Canadian society and the deep national insecurity from which this flows, Canadians have a tendency to imagine any cultural critique about themselves as being part of some grander US versus us moral binary, which in this case is the idea that if you care too much about stuff in the US, that somehow makes you a bad Canadian, and that we should instead all be striving towards some utopian ideal where Canadians barely think or talk about the US at all. But even if I am critical of Canadians who do not talk about Canada enough, I am also very critical of this overly apologetic or defensive reaction as well, and let me tell you why. One of the reasons why I am so fascinated by the country of Canada, and being Canadian, is because of the intense pathology of identity I feel Canadian nationalism imposes upon the people of this country. It is a pathology that I think is not terribly unlike those found in other countries that are very similar to their larger neighbors, like Ireland and Great Britain, or New Zealand and Australia, or Austria and Germany, or Pakistan and India. Basically, a sort of national anxiety that says that the country's struggle for political independence has failed unless a lot of easily observable cultural differences with the neighboring country exist. Obviously, all forms of nationalism are preoccupied to some degree with questions of demonstrating uniqueness, but I think the psychological burden of proving distinctiveness weighs heaviest on those countries who are clearly part of some larger geographic civilization, but have nevertheless been cut into discrete pieces, usually for reasons of imperial logic that are not self-evident today. Out of all of the big and little brother countries, Canadians and Americans are probably the two most similar nationalities in the world, and the two types of people that are most easily confused for each other, and frankly the most likely to be on the receiving end of jokes or dry comments by other countries about how indistinguishable we are. Like, have you heard this one? A Canadian and an American walk into a bar, and no one could tell them apart because they were culturally identical. This reality has been the case since Canada and the United States were first conceptualized as being different places, and it has been the case for the entirety of our history as independent countries. As much as some Canadian nationalists might like to nurse a fantasy that there existed some mythical era in the past where Canadians and Americans were understood to be like these aggressively distinct people. Now, the insecurity that this provokes among Canadians has manifested in all sorts of different forms over the years, from contrarian political movements that seek to push Canada to either the left or the right, depending on what's going on in US politics at the time, to efforts to limit or suppress trade with the US in order to demonstrate economic sovereignty, to more radical proposals that Canada should seek to outright ally with the geostrategic enemies of the United States. I think every Canadian will remember a moment from high school history class where a kid puts up his hand and asks if Canada could beat the US in a war. But in a day-to-day sense, this desire for Canadian distinctiveness probably manifests most aggressively in the form of a certain sort of middle-class Canadian who goes through life with an omnipresent gnawing in the back of their brain that they are not being distinctive enough. Or even worse, that they are acting too American. And this is why whenever you observe that a Canadian seems to be talking about US politics or culture an awful lot, the most common reaction from Canadians tends to be some sort of confession of personal shame or a statement of judgment towards other Canadians. Like, here are some of the most predictable comments I reliably get from my Canadian viewers whenever I broach these sorts of topics in a video. It sucks how your average Canadian follows American politics way more closely than Canadian politics. Too many Canadians these days are acting like wannabe Americans. Sadly, there's nothing more Canadian than being obsessed with the US. Now, the reason why I have a problem with this sort of thing is because, in my opinion, it is wrong to see US-Canadian relations as some sort of all-or-nothing binary. I think that we should instead seek to transcend the frame that takes it for granted that the natural and proper state of affairs on this continent is for there to be two countries locked in ongoing cultural competition based around a colonial ruler line drawn 200 years ago. I feel this is an assumption that is both ignorant as a matter of history and unhelpful as a means of understanding the present. I would instead posit that it is better to think of Canada and the United States as two halves of a single continental civilization populated by people who are about as culturally identical as one would expect the peoples of any other large geographic civilization to be. Now, that said, one of the paradoxical qualities of this shared continental cultural identity is a high degree of cultural diversity, since one of the founding premises of this shared civilization is a commitment to democracy and liberalism and tolerance. So there is a multicultural character to our culture, but it mostly manifests at the regional or community level rather than at the level of rival nation states. So, for example, Delaware has many differences from New Mexico or Saskatchewan, and families that live here with Chinese heritage have different traditions than families that live here with Russian heritage. And it is these sorts of differences that are more culturally meaningful than any imagined national distinctions we might try to find between the two countries on the opposite ends of this line. In short, to fixate on national difference is to miss the bigger story of what actually defines diversity in this part of the world. Likewise, when it comes to the cultural products that unify the diverse peoples of this continent, stuff like consumer goods and entertainment and certain moral or political beliefs, it has to be acknowledged that many of the great production centers of these sorts of cultural products are located on this side of the imaginary line. And by cultural production centers, I mean institutions like Hollywood and elite universities and large corporations. That is just a reality of how the history of this continent has played out, and the fact that these cultural production centers are disproportionately located on this side of the line, and for that matter, disproportionately located in just a handful of US cities, does not negate the fact that their influence affects every part of this continent. This really shouldn't be seen as a competitive failure on anybody's part. It is just a statement of undeniable cultural reality. And that reality is why I do not think there is anything inherently wrong with Canadians caring about cultural stuff that originates from the US. For Canadian cultural commentators to spend more time talking about Marvel movies than the movies of some indie Winnipeg director, for example. The former is just vastly more culturally significant to Canadians than the latter. It's for this reason that I've often argued that Canadians should just learn to make peace with the adjective American when describing our culture, and use possessive pronouns like are when describing American cultural products. This is just a fundamentally more accurate way to describe actually existing Canadian culture than pretending American cultural products are somehow foreign or exotic, or using clumsy adjectives like North American culture that, in my opinion, do nothing but signal Canadian insecurity. But JJ, you cry, what you're describing is exactly what all of those nice Canadian YouTubers in your video were doing. They accept American culture as their own and don't have any insecurity about it. So what are you complaining about? What I am complaining about is only that I wish more Canadian content creators would have a yes and approach to their socio-cultural commentary. I would personally like to see more Canadian content creators engage with some of the questions of Canadian identity and nationalism and distinctiveness and insecurity, and how these things manifest in Canadian society in addition to analysis of our shared American culture. In my opinion, it can be very fascinating and insightful to hear Canadians engage with some of these topics head on and talk about them explicitly, rather than just maybe dance around the edge of them every once in a while. I can give you a good example of someone doing it right, because in response to my previous video, one of the Canadian content creators I talked about, Curtis Connor, recorded a few personal thoughts on Canadian identity for his second channel podcast. And truly, I think that what he says is some of the most honest and self-aware stuff I've ever heard a Canadian YouTuber say.
I said it actually is incredibly Canadian to not talk about Canada. Being Canadian is it is strange. It is a strange sort of existence, but because it is like America, but just a little different. Just the vibes are like a little different. I don't know. It's tough to describe, but
okay. Now, politics is a slightly different situation, because I do think that some of the most meaningful and observable differences between Canadians and Americans manifest through the fact that we live under two different political regimes, which is, of course, the most practical consequence of having a border in two different countries. And when it comes to capital P politics, I absolutely think that Canadian creators should talk about our politics more, both because I think it is important to help spread awareness amongst other Canadians about the laws and rulers that we are living under, and because I think that the whole world's understanding of politics and public policy improves the more literate we become in the affairs of other places. But that said, the insecurity that I mentioned earlier that some Canadians feel about following US politics too closely is another example of unhelpful all-or-nothing thinking. A Canadian's interest in US politics can certainly be good or bad, but it has to be understood and judged in the context of what is motivating that interest, with some forms of interest being a lot more defensible than others. The least defensible motive, in my opinion, is the Canadian who is across-the-board anti-American and views American politics as little more than a repulsive form of entertainment that he can consume in a state of judgmental superiority. There exists a certain sort of smug middle-class Canadian who can always be counted on to describe American politics using derogatory terms like clown show or car crash or whatever, and always make a big deal about how he just can't take his eyes off the train wreck and that sort of thing. These sorts of Canadians are obviously very uncharitable and mean-spirited, and I don't think there's much to be said in the defense of people whose only interest in other countries is finding reasons to say, "Glad I don't live there." On the second tier, I would say you have Canadians who think about US politics in a way that acknowledges the cultural integration of our two countries, but also views this as a worrying thing, which is to say they view the US as basically a malign political force on this continent, in which American political developments are often the first symptoms of problems that will eventually make their way to Canada. Just like popsicles, Humvees, and the Beach Boys, what happens there will wind up coming here. A favorite line among Canadians of this sort is to characterize certain political ideas or techniques as being imported into Canada. So if a Canadian politician or activist behaves in a way that they don't like, they immediately characterize that behavior as an attempt to import some American-style idea into Canada, with the hope being that this blunt appeal to xenophobia will be enough to shut that idea down. In my experience, this sort of nervous surveillance of the American scene is mostly a progressive thing, with left-wing Canadians often very eager to characterize right-wing stuff in the US as being a harbinger of what right-wing Canadians will inevitably seek to import into this country, in part because right-wing Canadians are assumed to be the country's biggest Americophiles. In more recent years, however, I have noticed that some Canadians on the right are starting to get a bit more comfy throwing around the import stamp as well, characterizing things like racial justice protests or the trans rights movement or even climate change activism as fundamentally foreign ideas that progressives are importing from the US. And this means tracking what the US left is up to today is an important way to keep tabs on what the Canadian left will be up to tomorrow. Now, I don't think this attitude is completely without logic. As I said earlier, the big culture-producing institutions of this continent are mostly located south of the border, so it's not wrong to characterize the development and flow of new political ideas on this continent as being a mostly south to north thing. But at the same time, ideas are not like boxes of bananas. They're not crates of exotic novelties that you can pitch to any credulous simpleton. The idea that awful American ideas are colonizing Canada is paternalistic and condescending, and it takes away Canadian agency. If ideas or movements that originated from some particular US city or college or think tank or whatever have successfully spread across this continent, it is probably because they are based on something that broadly resonates with the people of this continent, because they make an observation that is true and important. Show me a Canadian who's throwing around the import label, and I'll show you someone who's worried he can't win a debate. Now, a third category is Canadians who participate in American political debates mostly as a kind of LARP or ARG. This is a line you often hear from people in this country, that American politics are just more interesting as a topic to think and argue about, especially online. And a lot of this comes down to the fact that US politics are a lot more small d democratic, which means that at any given time in the United States, there are a lot more open debates on a lot more divisive topics than there are in Canada, which means a lot more opportunities to exercise your intellectual muscles, even if it never goes beyond owning people on Twitter threads or Discord servers. But despite all of this, more often than not, I find that these sorts of Canadians have little interest bringing these passions to Canadian political debates in their own communities, either because they have no interest debating anything but the most dramatic and polarizing issues, or because their political passion was never anything more than a game in the first place. Lastly, we have the most defensible category, which are Canadians who follow American politics closely simply because they care. They care about Americans, they want the US to do well, they like the United States, and want to see it be the best version of itself. Going beyond that, however, they also understand the United States as a country that Canada is symbiotically linked to, a country whose survival and success, Canada's own survival and success, is predicated on. Because of our deep interconnectedness of trade and industry, whenever the US economy is booming, Canada's economy booms too. Whenever great technological innovations are made in the US, those innovations improve our lives too. And whenever US global leadership is strong, Canada's voice and influence on the world stage is amplified. In other words, there is a clear self-interested reason for Canadians to be invested in the US political process, but it is a self-interest based on a desire to share in American success rather than judge American failure. It is an affirmative desire to see Americans elect the best candidates and pass the best policies, not out of fear for the worst, but hope for the better. And that is basically my entire comprehensive worldview for how Canadians should conceptualize and promote the US-Canada relationship, be they influencers or not. I hope that you agree.